Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Mural, for hosting us in this Ask a Chief of Staff series. We're super excited to be kicking the series off. I'm Clara, and I'm the Program Director for Ondeck's Chief of Staff Fellowship, and I will be moderating the panel with our three stellar Chiefs of Staff. Couple of logistics and housekeeping to get out of the way. If you have any questions while the panelists are speaking or while we're going through the panel, feel free to drop them in the chat. Our Mural team will be collecting the questions and we will have a Q&A about midway through this session. So feel free to drop anything and everything that you want to ask into the chat, and our Mural team will collate all of those. We're also going to be sharing all the highlights from the discussion in a community forum, in Mural's community forum. So if something doesn't get answered or you miss something, we're all going to put all of the answers there, and we'll continue to answer questions after the panel as well. So definitely don't be shy, ask as many questions as you'd like. Want to make this as interactive as possible, and we can get started. So I introduced myself already, but if you missed it, I'm Clara, Program Director here at Ondeck's Chief of Staff Fellowship. I'm a former Chief of Staff myself, and so I'm super excited to be moderating this panel today. I'm going to pass it over to Ellise, who's going to introduce herself, and then we'll pass it on from there.
Awesome. Hey, everybody, I'm Ellise. I am our Chief of Staff at Y Systems. I've been with the company a bit over 4 years, and I'm excited to chat today.
Amazing. Kevin, you want to give it your intro?
Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Dious. I'm currently the Chief of Staff to the CEO of Reddit, and been with the company for about 4.5 years, and I'm excited to be here.
And Matt?
Morning and good afternoon. Yeah, Matt, I'm Chief of Staff at Spring Discovery. We're an early stage biotech startup, and I've been with the company now for about 2.5 years as Chief of Staff.
Amazing. So these are our three panelists for today. Thank you so much for taking the time. So maybe we can start with the Chief of Staff role overall. Would love to know how each of you got your start into the Chief of Staff role. So Ellise, would you let us know, how did you become a Chief of Staff?
Yeah, great question. So I started my journey at Y Systems on the ground, where I was doing customer experience work, helping from the beginning of the journey, onboarding our customers onto our product, and then helping them once they were live through continued care. So within that, I was able to kind of identify gaps and kind of build trust along with our leadership team for areas that needed to be improved, and kind of escalating or articulating the voice of the customer, so that when I was able to transition into this role, I was able to strategically kind of fill those gaps and that I had identified prior, and had built trust with the leadership team that I was continuing to work with.
Awesome. And Kevin, how did you get your start in your Chief of Staff role?
Yeah, so it was kind of a very unexpected path. I actually joined Reddit as a software engineer on what we call our anti-evil team, and I was working on that team for probably like almost 2 years. And so my relationship with my principal, Steve, our CEO, kind of started around mid-2019. He actually became the executive sponsor of our Black Employee Resource Group, and we started kind of working together. We were meeting kind of bi-weekly on, just kind of planning and working through, projects and things like that. And so around November 2019, he approached me about becoming his Chief of Staff. He had been thinking about bringing on one for a while. He had an exec coach who had been encouraging him. The board had been encouraging him as well. So yeah, we had a conversation, and he basically kind of mentioned, he's a former engineer. He liked my engineering background and my legal background. I'm actually a licensed attorney as well. He thought that might be helpful. And yeah, we had some conversations, and he asked me to kind of speak to 3 members of his exec team that he kind of really trusted and worked closely with. And sort of one thing led to another. And it was his first time having a Chief of Staff, and my first time sort of doing the role. And I just kind of said, this is an opportunity to get exposure to areas of the business that I never would get a chance to kind of see as an individual contributor. So kind of decided to kind of take the leap and see how it work out. And yeah, so far so good.
Amazing. I always like to say that Kevin holds the most degrees out of all of us here. You got the law degree, the computer science degree, you have us all beat. And Matt, would love to hear your journey into the Chief of Staff role as well.
Sure. So after doing my PhD at UCSF, I was a lead scientist at a startup. Decided, I no longer wanted to work at the bench, and had been longtime friends with this woman, Laura Deming, who was founder of the Longevity Fund and had just started a biotech accelerator called H1. So, I joined H1, was running operations there. About halfway through, I guess my now CEO Ben Kamens approached Laura and said, "Hey, can I poach Matt?" She didn't want to stand in the way, and Ben said, "Hey, do you want to be chief of staff?" I had no idea what it was, so I read a bunch of articles about it, and yeah, I've been working closely with him since then. I think the relationship has been great because Ben, as a first-time founder and non-technical founder of a biotech company, is able to lean on me with my PhD background in stem cell biology and regenerative medicine to help push projects forward, and to also kind of be the consigliere when people ask him to spend big bucks. Does it make sense?
Amazing. I think that's one of the things I love so much about the chief of staff role is that you can really get into it in all different capacities. You don't have to have a specific function or have a specific degree. It really does span quite a wide range of backgrounds, and so every chief of staff journey is quite different. Ellise, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what makes somebody well suited for a chief of staff role.
Yeah, definitely. So I think having some tribal knowledge is helpful, at least for me in my role, having worked with the customers, been able to identify those gaps and pain points. That really helped me. But I think also being like tenacious and having just this spirit within you is really important. And then also being inquisitive, asking the right questions, and again having that trust layer, I think is really imperative to be effective in the role.
Absolutely. Agreed with everything you said there. And in today's panel, we're really going to be talking about how to parachute in and delegate out. And so, I know that many of our audience and members, it seems like, have jumped out of planes, and it's not it's not an off analogy, right? Oftentimes chiefs of staff are very involved in a lot of different projects. You get pulled in to a special project here, maybe a department meeting there. And so one thing that's really important for chiefs of staff to be able to do is to parachute in, quickly get a lay of the land, and then kind of understand the scope of the project very quickly and start to ideate, offer solutions, figure out how exactly to push this project over the finish line. So Kevin, can you maybe tell us maybe some projects or instances where you've had to kind of put this kind of skill to practice?
Yeah, well, one is, so last year, right, COVID was just, kind of so unexpected and really disruptive. And so we had to kind of split up a task force. And so I kind of led the COVID task force kind of at Reddit. We were meeting daily just to kind of figure out what was going on. Things were changing. It's a big cross-functional team, some execs, directors, so it's just a lot of just sort of wrangling and just really trying to stay on top of everything and really trying to push the group to make decisions, make them quickly, and just kind of making sure people followed up. So that was a big one because, yeah, it just really transformed our business overnight, and we really had to pivot from being a sort of in-office regular, that sort of working style to just totally distribute overnight. And so a lot of coordination, a lot of wrangling, a lot of just sort of getting stakeholders together to kind of come to consensus and really get the company on the right path. And we had a very successful transition, but a lot of bumps along the road there.
Definitely. Matt, any situations where you've had to kind of put the skill in practice as well?
Sure. Yeah. So early on at Spring, we're an aging company. We had to build ourselves a biobank. And so to build a biobank, it's not just the scientists. We have to get buy-in from also our machine learning folks and our data scientists to figure out, how to go about creating the most optimal bank to, study therapies for aging. So I guess for myself, it was trying to figure out, what was the bare minimum that was needed, and then identifying partners that could help to, meet those requirements. And then ultimately, having weekly check-ins with folks to make sure, as things were changing on the data scientist side or on the machine learning side, making sure that our providers for the various, biosamples are able to deliver. So I guess it's, for me, just, weekly cadences and not being afraid to, ask people to make decisions. I don't know what it's like working with, other folks in various other fields, but scientists like to ask a lot of questions. They don't necessarily want to always, make decisions. So helping to force them to understand, like, this is a non-permanent solution. We can always iterate later, but we need to make a decision now.
Makes a lot of sense. And Ellise, maybe a question for you. So, because you have to have this kind of interesting skill of being able to get the lay of the land quickly, how might you suggest people can improve on building this skill set?
Good question. I think there are a couple things that really pop to my mind. The first is asking the right questions. You're working with stakeholders in all different areas of the company. And so you kind of have to peel back the layers of the onion and get to the right question so that you're getting the right answer. The second is just like not being afraid to pull up your sleeves. I think the chief of staff role, you often have to be a player and a coach where you're getting your hands dirty, you're in the game, as long as you're making things happen. And then the third, depending on if you're not the subject matter expert, is just identifying the right people at the right times and pulling them in when they're needed.
Yeah, definitely. I resonate a lot with that. I think a lot of the time, we have to use the context that we have, but we might not be the subject matter expert. And so how do you make sure you can get that credibility and the information that you need in order to see the big picture and put the puzzle pieces together? Yeah, Matt, any suggestions on how to get better at this skill?
Not necessarily. I think it's, having patience in yourself and others, I think, is probably the most important thing. There is, no one right way to do it. And just trying to stay optimistic in challenging situations is probably, the best advice that I can give you. It's, at least for myself, being a chief of staff is being a chief fire person, and having the understanding of it's a marathon, not a sprint, is important to keep in mind.
Yeah. And maybe a follow-up question to that, Matt, like once you're in the room and you've kind of assessed the situation, you've asked a lot of questions, how do you make sure your voice is heard, right? You're coming in and you're kind of like the third party coming into the meeting. How do you establish credibility in what you have to say?
Yeah, I think I'm in a unique situation given that I do have an advanced degree, and we are a biotech company, and I work with a group of amazing people. The bar to kind of get buy-in is fairly low. That being said, I think so much of getting that credibility is built outside of the meetings. So having check-ins with folks, getting coffee, getting lunch, getting beers, doing whatever it is that individual happens to like doing, so that when it does come time to ask them to do something hard or give them hard news, it's understood that it's nothing personal, it's just business, and people kind of respect you out of that.
Yeah. Kevin, I know you have some thoughts on kind of methods or maybe frameworks for doing exactly what Matt's saying, right? Building alignment and supporting decisions and execution. Anything you can tell us about how maybe you use your thought process to do things like that?
Yeah, so at Reddit, we have a heavy documentation culture. So I don't know if you've all kind of read like Jeff Bezos and how he kind of like to run Amazon, but we kind of have a similar style. So like, for example, for meetings, usually there's like documentation, a doc prepared before the meeting, and then we actually kind of spend time reviewing that, and then we all use Google Docs to kind of weigh in and all that. And so so we call it kind of our decision doc framework, and so that kind of helps us to really make sure everybody's on the same page. You can kind of be aligned. If I'm running the meeting, for example, my doc is going to have, AIs that are going to be clearly kind of labeled, the decision itself, the reasoning. So all that is kind of laid out in the doc. And so that kind of really helps us stay aligned. We've got sort of a record of this decision. So 6 months from now, if you need to go back and see, well, why was that decision made? What was the reasoning? You have that. And so it's something that's kind of served us well at Reddit. At times, it could be a little, sometimes you need to, poke people to kind of weigh in, but overall it's a pretty successful way to kind of help the meetings be more efficient and kind of make sure everybody's aligned. And it also, I think people, they tend to kind of think better when they can just kind of sit back and write out their thoughts versus just in a meeting where you have to kind of chime in and you might forget something. And so as a result, I think we get kind of, higher quality decisions and sort of, higher quality sort of thoughts that are shared in this doc process. So that's kind of one framework that we've used that we found to be, pretty successful.
Yeah, that's a great process. And at Ondeck, we're also a heavily written culture, and mostly because we're a fully remote company. So, writing everything down is super important, especially when not everyone's in the same room together. And also it gives you a history of documentation, right? So if a decision was made, you can go back and reference it. That way, if you have future decisions that are similar, you can use similar frameworks there.
Yeah, it also helps like the kind of the more quiet people, sometimes some folks are, very sort of vocal, right? Others not so much, but with the doc and we kind of live, you write in the doc live, it kind of helps those people to get their voice out and get their opinion heard as well.
Absolutely.
So we found that's been very helpful.
Great. So speaking of meetings, it seems like there are obviously tons and tons of meetings that go on, and there are a lot of different meetings that a chief of staff can be involved in as well. So Ellise, maybe how do you determine which meetings are important for you to be in, which ones you just need follow-up or being informed about? How do you make those decisions around that?
Good question. I think it depends on information that not only I'm involved in, key projects that are relevant to me, but also ones that I want to update our principal on. So I'm often involved in several different department meetings, and then whether or not I'm a participant or an orchestrator or just kind of looking for trends is based on that subject matter. So if I'm have a lot of knowledge on that topic, I'll often participate in it. And then other times I'm just orchestrating, facilitating, asking probing questions, and then identifying trends and making sure that people are following up so that we're getting to the outcome we want. We're very outcome driven at Y Systems, and we don't want to have a meeting just to have a meeting. So
absolutely. I think a big piece of knowledge that's been, or I guess a quote that's been passed around a lot in the last couple of years, especially with Zoom so prominent now, a good meeting can really make or break your day, right? If you have a good meeting, you have a good day. If you have a bad meeting, you have a bad day, and it just can permeate throughout the entire rest of your week or schedule. So Matt, after a meeting, let's say, you were part of the discussions and there are some action items, how do you prioritize what to take action on versus what to delegate? As a chief of staff, you can pretty much do both, right? You can kind of lead the project or you can actually execute on it. So how do you make decisions on which things you actually take action on versus what you delegate to other parts of your team?
Sure. So I think a lot of what I do is as a gap filler, figure out what it is the individuals that are on the meeting are best at, and then figuring out what it is that they need support on. And so we'll give them the tasks that they need to get done, but then either myself or I'll go find an expert to go help them to achieve their goals. For example, we spun up a not-for-profit, and we needed to figure out a not-for-profit to run a clinical trial for COVID. None of us have ever run clinical trials before. So our lead scientist took on the responsibility of project managing it. So it's her responsibility to kind of figure out with our data scientists, like how big should the trial be? What are the ideal drugs to be testing for the trial, et cetera, et cetera. And then for myself and another person on our team to go and identify like who are the best operations and program managers for a clinical trial that we could hire on and bring on to support our lead scientist. So it's always identifying people's strengths, allowing people also to stretch when they feel like they can, but also being willing to step in and say like, sure, you have degrees and whatnot, but you've never run a clinical trial before, so let's go hire an expert to get it done.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of the chief of staff role is kind of having a high EQ and understanding people, and understanding, what are people good at, what aren't people good at, making sure the right people are being delegated to. Kevin, same question, are there any mental models you use to prioritize on what to take action or when to delegate?
Well, so for me, it's maybe a little different than I kind of default delegate. That's because, here at Reddit, I mean, we're about 1,100 people now. So generally speaking, when there are AIs or things that come up, like usually they fall in somebody else's sort of bucket, or there's somebody who's sort of better equipped to kind of carry out that task than I am. So my role is mainly kind of following up, making sure that thing gets done when it's time to get it done. Now, of course, there are going to be times when things come up that doesn't really fit in a nice bucket, and then I will sort of raise my hand and sort of, get it done. But, I look at my role as like my main responsibility is to Steve, our CEO, to make sure that he is good. And then, and so, there are things with him that, I'll work on and handle. But yeah, a lot of times when we're in cross-functional meetings, usually it's somebody else who's ultimately responsible. So, I will end up sort of delegating to them. But yeah, I mean, but of course I have to track it and follow up and make sure, that the follow through is there and we kind of get done with that. And so, but yeah, if there are times where maybe it's a little vague or unclear, then I'm going to follow up on Slack or Signal after the meeting and say, hey, this came up, do you have this, or should I step in and whatnot? And so, yeah, we kind of, there's trust there and we work through that. But yeah, I'm sort of default delegate. So,
yeah, and maybe to clarify for some of our participants, can you define what an AI is?
Oh, sorry, action item. Apologies. So yeah, in the meeting, there's going to be some tasks, something to get done, right? That's it. And to my mind, that's the point of the meeting is you're going to discuss and there's going to be work to be done. So yeah, the AI, the action item there.
Awesome. I default for me, AI always stands for artificial intelligence. So like you guys are doing some hard work in those meetings. Awesome. And so you're a delegator, which leads us right into our next question. What are some do's and don'ts when it comes to delegation?
Well, my pro tip here is simply when we need somebody to get something done, I say mention your principal is the one who needs it, right? So I'll say, I don't do it that often, but there are times where it's kind of like, hey, Steve needs you to do this, not Kevin, right? And so when they think the ask is coming from the CEO, people tend to kind of move a little bit faster and sort of happily take on that task. So that's kind of, I mean, honestly, it's kind of the pro tip there. It's the ask comes from Steve, which generally it does. So it's not like it is the truth there, but I just tend to find I get more success there. And so, yeah, other than that, I mean, again, you just need to kind of, if there is something to delegate, you need to track it. So yeah, Steve and I have a task management system we use. And so, yeah, I've got all the notes in there in terms of what it is, when it's due, and who's responsible, and kind of make sure to follow up with them. So.
Got it. Matt, same question. What are some do's and don'ts, any pro tips you have when it comes to delegation?
Sure. I think what's really important to always remind folks of, especially if it's a task that is not necessarily fun or very much in the weeds, is just reminding of the bigger picture of like how this fits into the larger project or larger goal of the company. The littlest thing, like I had to sit our lab team down yesterday and remind them best practices and how to ship things, right? It's annoying, but if we don't have some consistency in how we ship our patient samples, there will be larger issues for the company later on. So reminding, like, please do it this way. I know you want to iterate on it, but don't. We have processes for a reason. Here's the whole reason why we have these processes. I think that helps to get buy-in, especially for those more annoying tasks.
Absolutely. And Ellise, after you delegate things out, what's the follow-up? What do you do to make sure things get done, or how do you make sure the people who are responsible are truly responsible for those things?
Yeah, I'm very persistent. So not only in our leadership meeting do I have a joint to-do tracker where every week they're 1 week to-dos and people get tracked done or not done. It's very clear, but also I'm always following up via Slack, or if I have to call somebody, people know I will track them down. So they get a message from me, they know like I got to get that thing done, and it will be reviewed the next week. But it's really important to have follow through as a chief of staff and make sure people can depend on you and know you're going to get it done when you say you will.
Absolutely. And Kevin, I know you mentioned some tracking systems or tracking management that you have with your principal. Can you maybe walk us through like what that might look like high level?
Oh yeah. So I mean, kind of the way we generally tend to work, like actually I have access to his email kind of via the delegate feature of Gmail, G Suite. And we have we used to use Asana, and then they changed some UI stuff that frustrated Steve. So we moved to another system called TickTick. It's pretty simple. We just have a shared task board that I'm able to add tasks and he can see them. So what I tend to do in most of the meetings, actually, I tend to be kind of more quiet. I'm more listening. So when something does come up for Steve to do, I will just sort of really jot that down. I will assign a date, I assign it to him. So then he gets the notification, he sees it. And in theory, he will sort of, monitor that, every day and kind of try to like knock off those tasks. And so we also use another sort of technique that we learned from one of his exec coaches, where we use a dictation system where, so if Steve has a thought, it's kind of like he'll just whip out his phone and hit a button. He can actually dictate the message, and then it comes straight to me. Then I can kind of listen, get the full color of what he wants, and then I will, again, sort of queue that up in the task management system. And then we have our one-on-ones on Mondays. So I try to kind of, if there's time, we'll kind of go through what's outstanding, and just kind of make sure that he's on track to kind of knock those things out.
That's really awesome. That's a really great framework and can be applied to, I think, many people's different schedules and iterations of how to think through and prioritize and work through things. Okay, so I have one more question before we open up the floor for the Q&A, but leadership meetings are probably very exhausting, right? A lot of the meetings that we are in are probably just a lot. So how do you bring some fun into these meetings and kind of lighten the mood a little bit, if you will? Ellise, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, thinking through this one, it was interesting to think about, because oftentimes my job is just to get stuff done, and it's not to be the fun person because I'm following through on tasks. But one thing that we have cultivated the practice of doing is making sure the whole human is addressed. So in our leadership meetings, we start out with a quick, just like personal check-in, and we have a system of green, yellow, red. Green, they're doing good. Yellow, maybe like some things aren't going their way, they might need some help. Or red is like, hey, I just want you all to know, like, I'm not doing okay. And that has been a great way for us to, even though it's not super fun, to just address the whole human, make sure that, we're being honest with each other, so that like, hey, we missed this task. Probably, there's maybe some other things going on, and how can our team come together and like support those people?
I really love that sentiment of addressing the entire person. I think, for a long time, we were able to kind of separate our work selves and our personal lives, but obviously with COVID happening, those spaces have melded together. And so, understanding that if someone's not showing up to work, it's, there's something going on, and understanding that that person is a whole person and not just that work individual, I think is super important. And I think that the more we're able to bring our whole selves to work as well, we're going to perform better. So feeling like that person is addressed is definitely a very beneficial environment. Kevin, anything you want to add here in terms of making leadership meetings fun, or just meetings in general fun?
So one thing we do with the exec team, we call the C staff, is that, and those are on Tuesdays. And so part of that doc, actually, every person gives an update. And so that, like, part of that, you're sort of, the format there is you give a status update, which is kind of like what's going on in your life. Then you kind of give like work, what's going on. And then we have a section for like, what's something new that you've learned through reading, a book you've read or something like that. So everybody kind of gives that, and the execs kind of feed off of that. They will then comment, oh yeah, that's great, I read that book or whatever. And then, just really the first probably 5 to 6 minutes of the meeting are just dedicated purely to just kind of catching up, talking, joking, or whatever. Like we're kind of intentional about kind of giving space for that time. And so, just kind of helps. And because, we're all people. It's not, we're here to do work, but, we just try to make sure that there's time for people to kind of have that human connection, especially over Zoom. It's just so tough in this day and age with Zoom. We just kind of really try to do our best to allocate a little time at the beginning of every meeting for that kind of catch up time, that human time, human connection, bonding time, if you will.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I know that we have a couple of questions from the audience, so I'm going to have the mural team actually pull up a mural board that should have all of the questions that we've kind of curated and collated over the discussion. And we'll take a look through these and kind of answer as we see fit, but don't hesitate to continue to throw questions in the chat. We'll continue to add to this board, and we can really continue the conversation. So Matt, let's actually step back a little bit. I think there were quite a few questions about the chief of staff role in general. So couple of differences that I know people wanted to distinguish between. So Matt, maybe you can give us, what's the difference between a chief of staff and a COO, or maybe, a program or portfolio manager, or even an EA. I think there's a lot of kind of vernacular being thrown around. So maybe you can better define it for us.
Yeah, I think it's very company dependent. To be honest, part of the reason why I wanted a role like this is I do ultimately want to be something like a chief operating officer. I think, yeah, it's a really exciting role in my mind. So how does it differ between a PMO, an EA, et cetera? So for myself, because I had that subject matter expertise, I kind of was brought in to support the CEO in making decisions, support the CEO in project management of things that he couldn't handle and he didn't want to delegate to our head of discovery or some of our lead scientists. I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, it's, even the role of COO is hard to define. I will say that I did see another question that got raised. So he does have an executive assistant separate from myself. So basically high level tasks that require like, defining a budget or owning a science project or helping with recruiting or, helping to hire a new external board member, that stuff comes to me. Things related to scheduling and emails and, little gifts and whatnot go to the executive assistant. I tend not to take on that role now. Granted, when we were 7 people, this is the type of stuff that I was doing. But now that we are 22, 23, 24 people, we now have the support staff to be able for me to delegate out those other tasks. Hopefully that answers the question. It's hard. It's hard to define. It's really company specific and your manager specific.
Definitely. I think that's one of the exciting things about this role, but also one of the more hard to define things about this role is that it really can span quite a few different functions. And sometimes you feel like you're doing the work of an EA, a PMO, and a COO all at the same time. So I think it really does, like Matt said, depend on the organization. It depends on the size of the organization, right? The smaller you are, the more hats you're going to wear. Ellise, maybe a close follow-up question, do you feel like an organization needs to be a certain size in order to have a chief of staff? Or maybe if you've seen the company grow, how have you seen the chief of staff role change as the company grows in size?
That's a good question. I don't know if it has to necessarily be a certain size. I think at least when it made sense for our company was when our CEO started to get to the point where it was like, okay, like I want somebody to help me strategize with my time, take on some of these key projects where he was able to handle those prior. And so we were actually, mid-size before he brought one on for the first time, which was myself. Whereas it sounds like Matt was in the role early when they were quite small. So I think it just depends. I think often for smaller companies, you may not have the title, but you're wearing a lot of those hats. Whereas when you grow a bit, you end up getting doing the role and it being more specified. Still wearing hats though.
always lots of hats. I think that's a classic chief of staff wardrobe, if you will. Kevin, this one I think might be a good question for you because you came up through a software engineering role, right? Where it's very easily defined by I shipped this, I shipped that, or this is the thing that I built. So with this more kind of ambiguous nature of the chief of staff role, how do you go about defining success with your principal? How does he know like you've accomplished something, or how do you put your name on and stamp it on something that you've done?
Yeah, I'll be honest, that's been the big challenge for me. I was so used to, I had these projects I owned, from soup to nuts, and I deployed this or whatever, right? So you could, hey, this is out in the wild now, right? And so it is a challenge. I mean, I try not to get too caught up on like, I did this or whatever, at the end of the day, the way I look at it, as long as he is operating at a high level and getting stuff done that he needs to get done, my principal, Steve, that's all that really matters. So, he and I, like I said, we have our weekly one-on-ones, we have check-ins, I'll just sort of remind him, hey, this, we had this thing that was supposed to get done. It's now done, and just any follow-ups. So it's a little tough to kind of, you just have to be comfortable with that. Like, you're not going to have these like big meaty projects. Sometimes you might, I mean, depending on your role as chief of staff, but it's at the end of the day, my goal is to get him more efficient and to get him executing at a higher level. So as long as, he's checking off those things that I'm queuing up for him, or these things that he's given to me that I just come back and say, hey, this was done, here's the result. There may be a little documentation in there. But yeah, like it's so weird. It was such a weird transition for me because I was so used to these like big banner projects that I could just say, here it is, and you don't really have that chief of staff. You're going to get stuff that's so small, stuff that's larger. And so, yeah, I wish I had a better answer. It's just that you just have to get comfortable with the fact that it's just, communication with your principal, making sure you're all on the same page, and just making sure that what he or she, needs to get done is getting done. And, they'll feel it at the end of the day. They know that if they're making progress on certain things, or if they're not. And so yeah, so I know it's a little hand wavy answer, but it's just execution, and just, keeping track of kind of what's being done in the task management system or via the decision docs that we have or whatever. And, just making sure that he's aware of what's going on and in the loop.
That makes a lot of sense. I know one thing that I did with my CEO when I was a chief of staff was do a kind of general feelings check-in almost, like, how are you feeling? If you're feeling stressed, that means I'm not doing my job. Or if you're feeling frantic or that you don't know what's going on, then that means I wasn't doing my job. But if he's like, oh, I feel pretty calm about things, I feel like I have a good handle on what's going on in the company, then I feel like, I'm giving him the right information and he is feeling able to like use his brain for those big picture strategy things, as opposed to feeling like, did the cleaning person get paid? I don't want him worrying about those types of things. So I think that's actually a perfect segue into the working with our CEOs and other leaders questions. Matt, maybe when you took on this role, I know that, you kind of found this role through a connection of a connection. How did you go about building relationship or trust with your CEO?
Oh, good question. How did I? I think the trust was built when I was at Age One, working with Laura and the 5 other teams in addition to Spring. He saw me cooking dinner for the teams. He saw me taking trash out. He saw the ability for me to kind of manage a cohort of volunteers for our demo day. So I had the unique opportunity to have him see me work for 4 months before making the decision that I was the person that he wanted to work with as his chief of staff. I think I've continued to build that relationship and have that trusted chief of staff role through just kind of being open and personal, telling him things that are going on well in my life, like why things might be slacking, why things might be great, and also giving him direct feedback when I think he's being this is a family audience, so I won't say the particular words I wanted to say, but not being afraid to step up and say, like, you're doing a bad job. It can't always be, I don't want to be the yes man or yes person, and I think that's helped tremendously to maintain that trust in him and relationship with Ben.
Similar questions for Ellise. Same thing. You also came up through, more of a customer success role. So you had more kind of defined deliverables, things like that. How did you make that transition into, becoming a chief of staff where those goals are a little less defined? And also same question about, building trust. How did you establish that relationship with your principal?
Yeah, our company loves to use the term taking out the trash, and we don't want to, ever say like, that's not my job. And so I think within my first role, I was wearing a lot of hats and was never afraid to take out the trash, whether it was literal or whether it was jumping in my car and like doing some QA testing myself, or, staying up while customers called me at 2 a.m., like whatever it took to make sure that our business was like treating our customers the way we needed to. And so I think through multiple years of like seeing that, and also, finding those gaps, pointing it out, making sure I was always putting the customer first, I was able to build, his trust that I was going to not only do what was best for the company, but I also have extremely high expectations, not only of myself, but our company. And so I want to hold, our company to that. And I think that helped create that trust between us.
Absolutely. And I think obviously there's always a difference when you're coming up through the company through a different function and having somewhat of a relationship already, and you can build on that. I came in completely kind of out of the blue, right? I applied directly for the chief of staff role. And so building that relationship from scratch can be quite difficult, right? This is a new person that you haven't met before. And so it was exactly, it reiterating what Matt and Ellise have said. It's saying, yes, I'm going to help out however I can. There's no task too small, and executing on those things quickly and well that can really show, I'm able to do these things, so you can start to entrust me with bigger projects and kind of build your way up from there. Kevin, a specific question from you, has your CEO, has Steve ever directly told the team, anything Kevin says is what I'm saying, or, what's the delegation in terms of what are things that are coming from you versus Steve?
Good question. I'm trying to think. I think in the beginning, yes, he did sort of say that. Obviously, we've hired like a lot of people since then. And I think I've been very fortunate. It's just kind of been implicit. Like people understand if Kevin reaches out, like it's really for Steve. So he did kind of set the tone, in the beginning with the exec team. Like, he's like, look, Kevin, he sees everything. I'm with him in every meeting. So like, he's like, he sees everything. You should assume that if you tell me, Kevin's going to know, and so that's just kind of helped so that there's just that trust there that like the exec team and everybody else kind of in the org generally knows that like, I'm in the loop in everything. And so yeah, but I think I do remember in the beginning, when I first started attending exec team meetings, he kind of made a statement or two and, just kind of understood. So yeah, thankfully, yeah, it's I've had no issues, people, I have to sometimes request access to documents. They forget to tag me on them sometimes, but other than that, yeah, it's pretty implied that I'm able to sort of, my ask is on behalf of him, so people tend to kind of follow through.
Absolutely, and I think that's a part of positioning yourself as a chief of staff too, right? Making sure that you're there to empower the organization, and the only way you can do that is by getting the buy-in of the rest of the people that you're working with, and for them to really understand what your position in the organization is. Matt, maybe you can talk a little bit about, you support the CEO, there are other leadership executives as well. How do you work across organizations, across departments, with other leaders in the organization, even though you report directly up to the CEO?
Yeah. So what's been great about my role as chief of staff at Spring is because I was able to come in early on, again, I was a 7th employee. I was able to develop a good relationship with the early folks and kind of work with them to get what they needed off the ground. So, for a head of discovery and our lead scientist, building them a lab and helping with hiring on research associates and scientists and building that relationship. And then as we brought on other people that were in these leadership type positions, supporting them on behalf of the CEO to get their projects off the ground. So when we brought on our head of product, Brandon White, he wanted to build our immunology program. So it was he and I finding partners, finding advisors, finding consultants. So I've been lucky in that when new people come on, I tend to get tapped to work with them to get something done. Then once it's off the ground, then I move on to something else. And also, again, coffees, lunches, dinners, inviting people over for Formula One watching parties.
Oh, that's amazing. I just started watching Formula One on Netflix and I'm obsessed. So that's a great
so
idea.
good.
I'm going to start doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think exactly what you're saying, just talking to people and building that relationship ahead of time, right? So it's not the first time you're going to this executive, it's to ask them for something. I've talked to other chiefs of staff who they used to do a lot of walk and talks, right? They just walk around the office, see who's around, grab coffee with someone. And now that we're in a Zoom world, I had one chief of staff tell me she used to just pick up the phone and call people using the company directory. And people were always worried because they're like, why is the chief of staff calling me? And she just said, I just wanted to check in, just see how everything's going and get a lay of the land. So I think that's definitely a lot of it, just understanding who you're working with and what they're up to in a personal sense, right? Not always work related.
Yeah, and maybe add just one quick thing to that is, coming from a science background, it was my job to be the person to run a project. I think, as a chief of staff, you have to remember that delegation is so important, and part of delegation is relationships. So I can't emphasize enough, as a single contributor transitioning to a manager slash chief of staff role, like it's okay that you aren't the person crunching the numbers and whatnot. Like it's other people's responsibility to get that done. Yeah, just as an aside.
Yeah, definitely. Agreed on all accounts there. Ellise, I think these two questions actually kind of go together, and I think you'd have a good perspective on this. But let's say, your CEO is kind of losing time because of all the things that are on their plate, right? There's a lot of priority that needs to happen, right? There's a million different projects. How do you help them prioritize? How do you give them advice or try to figure out, how can you best spend your time? How do you have those conversations?
Yeah, I think the first thing is we typically just like talk through each of them and kind of listen. So if I'm able to kind of understand what he's thinking about them, where he sees them in terms of priority, I'm able to say, okay, well, I'm going to take this, and this, and I'll kind of take those and run with them so that he can do X, Y, and Z. But understanding, if he's thinking about them differently or if he has a different prioritization than I do, that's one way. And then also understanding, like if I already have specific meetings lined up or he does, well, you can talk about this in your one-to-one and I'll tackle this in this specific meeting, is another way we typically do that, just to make sure that we're using both of our time efficiently. He said, think of your time like my time. And so I want to make sure we're prioritizing both.
Absolutely there. Kevin, any thoughts on like how to prioritize different projects or, how to best spend your CEO's time?
So I think, yeah, I did an assessment maybe a few months in, with Steve, and I, just kind of thinking like what are the things that he's most responsible for, right? At the end of the day, for us, it's been sort of fundraising, relationship with investors, managing the board, sort of in his relationship there, sort of managing the exec team. There's kind of press and media. And then there's what I think what we're kind of really working on now is like his role is like what I call chief culture officer, right? And so those are to me, the 5 big buckets that sort of he kind of is responsible for, right? And so I kind of try to make sure if there's things that are coming up that don't really fall in one of those buckets, it's kind of like, do you need to be doing this? Is there somebody else who can do it, right? Or can I do it for you, or whatever it is, right? And so I think, so that's kind of one thing I just think about. The other thing is that every week when we have our one-on-one and our doc, I just try to kind of list out like, what I believe are the top 3 priorities for the week for him. And so we just kind of talk about those and make sure that we're aligned there. And so if things come up that don't really fall in one of those 3 things, it's kind of like, is it that important, and usually it's not. So I'll kind of, prioritize a little lower, or on task management system, that whatever that thing is might have a, later due date or something that's for the next week or week after. So, but yeah, just try to take the high level, like kind of view of like, what are his main responsibilities, overall. And then for that week, what are the main priorities? And then try to, work from there as I prioritize things.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think also while you build that relationship with your CEO, it's really about trying to understand how he thinks through things or how she thinks through making decisions so that you can also come to the same conclusions. It's not necessarily that you have to have the same opinions about everything, but you should understand that thought process quite a bit. Okay, well, I know we have a couple of minutes, so maybe some fun tools and templates type questions. I know these ones are always fun to kind of share in terms of what everyone is using, and I know we mentioned quite a few different things. Maybe a quick one for our panelists. How many monitors do each of you use? Feel free to jump in and let us know.
I'm down to the single monitor these days. I'm a huge fan of the dual monitor system. Yeah, I used to have that in the office, but since we were not there anymore, I just kind of make do with one. But I guess maybe I'd suggest either 2, or if you get one giant monitor, that'd be great. Because I have too many tabs open all the time. It's kind of a pain. I get lost in my number of browser windows and tabs.
I'm at 2 screens. I would love a 3rd. I have a lot of tabs open, but 2 is still better than 1. So
I'm a laptop external monitor, and some days I'll pull out my iPad as well.
Awesome. I'm a 2-monitor gal myself. So, and Kevin, I know you mentioned a dictation question, or there's a product you used. What's the product that you use there?
Yeah, good question. So we actually, Steve had some like security concerns about this other method. So I'll give with the coaches, what they sort of recommend, and then what we end up doing. I think there's a system, I think it's called Zephyr, I believe, or something like that, where you can link it. It's kind of a if then this that type system where on your phone, you can kind of set it up where, you hit a button, you do the voice recording and then it'll pop up an email and you just hit send and then it'll like, that email will then go to the Asana project and then create a task. So, but we end up actually even simplifying it even easier by using, the iPhone now has their whole, the way you can create kind of automated tasks or whatever. I forget the shortcuts, right? So we set it up actually even simpler where we do it's like a shortcut in the iPhone. And then, that will basically generate an email that goes to an Asana project that then, that I monitor. And then, so I actually get the recording in Asana. So then I can listen and then assign that task to myself or to somebody else. So that's what we found has been very helpful. Sometimes if Steve is really lazy, he'll just use Signal. He'll just like dictate it in Signal, then I get it. So that helps. But the Asana one's kind of nice because you get it in the Asana project in the task. You can, you get an Asana task and then you can like add to that the description and then you've got the full context. So if you need to assign it to somebody else or whatever, they could actually hear Steve sort of give the full color on what this thing is that he wants, right? Instead of, picking up bits and pieces on something you might write. So yeah, we found that to be pretty helpful.
That's really awesome. That's a really great idea. My roommate loves sending voice memos. I feel like it's very similar. So just having, a quick kind of stream of consciousness, if you will. And let's end on this one, a fun question for all of our panelists. What's the best single purchase or maybe tool or trick or productivity hack that you've had that has really increased your ROI as a chief of staff? I will start and I will say Paste. If you've ever used that, I love using Paste. It helps you basically curate all the things you've ever copied throughout a really long history. So you can just pull them up. You can actually search it. It's really helpful for my Calendly links because I have 3 different ones that I use for different people. So I can pull those up really fast. So I would definitely look into Paste.
I'd say my hack that I found useful actually is really simple, which is like, on the Mac, you can just kind of do a screenshot or you can do a snippet of the screenshot, right? So often I'm playing telephone, right? So somebody will Slack me something that I need to go reach out to somebody else, right? And instead of me having to sit and retype and paraphrase or whatever, oftentimes, if it's shareable, I'll just like screenshot like the Slack combo and then like take that and paste it into the person who I need to, talk to and say, hey, I want to follow up on this or whatever. So they can see the context of the conversation I had with the other person. I'm not having to recreate the conversation over here. So it is a quick, it was a command 4. And then I can just kind of snap that. And then I just, drop it into the person who I want to chat with. So I don't know, I found that to be kind of helpful. So they're kind of getting the full context of the conversation and not, not having to retype a paragraph or whatever, so it just kind of helps save me some time.
This is maybe a bit touchy-feely. An Oura ring, actually. Sleep, exercise, movement, so important for myself, especially. It definitely affects my mood. And then also my ability to be effective in my role. So, making sure that I'm getting sleep and when I'm not, communicating that to folks so that we can make changes so that can be improved.
This one's a tough one for me. I'm not sure, but one of the things that pops into my mind is that within Asana, I have just a section for people with their names. So I would have Clara and I'd have Kevin and I'd have Matt. And then as things pop up, I just put it under their section. I don't need to talk about it with them until like the next time I'm going to meet if it's not urgent. And so I don't have to remember, it's out of my mind. And then the next time I meet, I'm like, oh, perfect. I have a list of all the things I wanted to talk to them about. So that has actually really helped me to not have to have like Slack conversations if I don't need to yet. And also like mull things over a little bit further.
Amazing. I love that system, just kind of a notes type of thing where you can just dump everything in there so you don't forget it, which I know I always do. Well, we're almost at the end of the hour here. I wanted to thank everybody for joining us in this panel. I mentioned earlier on that I run an Ondeck's Chief of Staff Fellowship, and actually all three of our panelists were fellows in that fellowship. So if you're interested in learning more about the Chief of Staff Fellowship, it's a year-long program. You can go to this URL. We'll also send it out to everybody afterwards, but it's a great network. It's a great curriculum and content. And so, any of our panelists, I hope, will be able to speak to their experiences. Don't forget to continue the conversation. So our community forum for Mural, you can continue to post questions and we'll answer those throughout the week. And also feel free to try out Mural. That was all the sticky notes you saw where your questions were on. That was Mural live at work. So thank you again for joining us. Feel free to connect with any of us on LinkedIn. Would love to continue to have the conversations with you all, and have a great rest of your week, everyone.